So we can start. So
Okay.
first of all, thank you for finding time among all these duties that you have here to talk with me. So the first thing that I would like to ask you is what are your views on the rules that used by Swordfish and by the Nordic League after a few years of testing it with some adaptations, of course, over time, but basically are you happy with it?
Well, that is a yes and no question.
Okay.
Yes, we are happy with it in the sense that higher points for deep targets means that people are motivated to go for deep targets, and therefore you tend to see more interesting techniques. Yes, we are happy with it because you cannot just do a suicide attack, because if the other person can score as well, then you risk something. And so it places the responsibility of clean fencing on the attacker. Yes, it's good because it has historical precedent. This rule set we came up with from reading the Bolognese 15th century sources and looking at the way that old Fexschule competitions were held, where you fence to the highest hit. In reality, that plays out a bit like the weighted system we have, where both people can score within the afterblow tempo. So we are happy for that. I think we saw longer, more interesting exchanges. No, we are not happy with it because there's obvious disadvantages with it. You can game it, you can open a target, you can give a 1 to get a 2, for example. You can give an arm hit in order to strike to the head, which is ridiculous, of course, from a martial perspective in many ways. No, we are not happy with it because the fencing can look a bit messy, and that is something that we would like to see change. So it's definitely yes and no. Also, what happens, of course, is that if you work with one rule set for long enough, the fencers adapt, and that they are supposed to. That's the reason why it's the rule set is a motivator to see the skill set and the fencing that you want to. But there will always be a point in time where fencers adapt to the point, or in such a way that the rule set is no longer promoting the fencing that you want to see. It is never going to. We're never going to get to a stage where the rule set is perfect. I think just as with any other human activity, there will be a constant adaptation. And for us, we're actually at a time where we have done the Nordic rules for so long. We are now actively looking at a completely different ways of doing things.
Okay, so I would ask about that later, but first, could you summarize briefly the guidelines for the current rule set?
Yes, so the guidelines are coming from Swordfish, and what we had at Swordfish is a huge amount of different cultures and nations and clubs and ideas of fencing to meet, and we wanted to have a simplified rule set. If we made it too advanced, it would be very hard for us to pull off this kind of event. In a uniform monocultural event where everyone's from the same club with the same country, you can have more advanced rule set, but here it's not possible. So we, for example, we remove the double hit. Now you can have a very clear open double, can be penalized, but it's not part of the scoring system, because the frequency of what we thought was erroneous calls were so high that it just frustrated people. So we wanted to simplify things. So that's one thing we're coming from. Beyond that, when we started out when we hadn't put much thought to it, and we started out with 1 point for the whole body, you saw a lot of attacks to shallow targets. And it could be exciting, but it wasn't exactly what we were looking for, because the manuscripts display techniques that often goes to the deep targets, to the head and torso and so on, and we tried to encourage that more. And when all the targets were valued the same, we saw people going in and sacrificing themselves to touch the leg of someone, not caring about the fact that they could get hit on the head. And it was one of those things that works really well sometimes and not at all in other times. And we thought it was time to change, but we didn't want to do it without having some sort of basis for it. So we started looking at the little things we had on historical sources. And what we thought worked okay for us was the Bolognese and looking at the Fexschule thing, and we ended up here.
Okay, thanks a lot. So earlier you mentioned that the current rule set manages to produce more interesting techniques. Could you elaborate on that? What do you understand?
From what we saw back then compared to now, yes, because you have now you are encouraged to go deeper, and when you go deeper, you tend to have to use more maybe longer sequences, or some of the techniques that you see more in the manuals. A wind into the torso, for example, can be difficult to achieve. And if you get just as much point for striking someone from a distance to the hand or to the leg, you don't have an incentive to go for those techniques. But if you're motivated to go deep, then you will start to see techniques that they come from the sources that are simply more entertaining to watch, the longer combinations and so on. And I think that's what they had something similar back in historical times as well.
Okay, and you also mentioned that you are aware that fencers will adapt, and this can distort, let's say, the effects of the rule set, and you are probably preparing something. So
yes, absolutely. I mean, I'm not very happy with how the fencing looks today, to be honest. Because there are too many. Like every time you see someone gets 3 points, another person gets 2 points. Because we don't call it a double, people forget that
it's a double.
They both got hit. Yeah. So yes, historically that's how it was, and I think that's just something that will happen in fencing. I mean, we see how the modern fencing have right away as a way of solving this, and we try to come up with always solving it, but it's inherent in what we do. But I think you see a bit too much of it, and we want to mix that up. Absolutely. I mean, several years ago, people were almost emotionally attached to the rule sets. Today, I don't care. Like, I just want to see good fencing. If it's how you do it, or if it's how Italians do it, or the Americans, I don't care. I just want the fencing to be nice. And what I think is that it will be a constant adaptation to circumstance. It's like swords and armor. One gets better, so the other has to get better. You know, one changes, the other has to change. And with fencers and rule sets, it's going to be the same.
Okay, and can you? I mean, do you think that one can fix the fencing in a given community by the use of the rule set?
Not only. No, you need a culture. You need a culture where people are by their own accord wanting to fence in a certain way, and that is really hard, but it's doable. You know, if someone fences it, I think most of us know when we see someone who is too sporty or not honorable in the way he or she fences, that person tends to get shamed, or they won't get much recognition. And that's something you can work with also. I mean, shame is a very powerful motivator. People want to be appreciated. They want to be known as the person who fences in a good way, and what that means can be different things. But I think it's a mix between rule sets and culture. Absolutely.
Okay, but those terms that let's say sporty or not honorable are a bit vague.
They're very vague. And
so could you elaborate a bit? I mean, this time personally, what do you consider not sporty or honorable?
Well, I think hits that are way too light. Just taps is something that we can do away with, and we should motivate people to not striking with the flat, for example. But there are historical precedents for that. But what we do, I don't think you should do that. I think striking in a controlled manner. I think fencing in a way that shows that you have the intention to fence in an historical fashion with historical techniques. I think that is a thing. I think going into a fight without the intention to use damage as a tactic. In
your own damage?
No, damaging the other person.
Okay.
Like if you and I were fencing, and I would just try to hit you on the thigh until you started to limp, and then I would just go for your head. I mean, that is something that you can work with rules against that, but it also just should be in the fencer not to act in that way. Sporty is more difficult because there are many things that modern fencing do that are just fantastic. So what sporty means is very different. Some people say that any hit to the hand is very sporty.
Right.
But if I was fighting for life and death, I would hit the hand because that's where he's holding his sword. It's the perfect thing to do. So it comes down to culture. And it is always going to be hard. What is your motivation for coming here? To win, of course, but to win within parameters that are not only in the rules but also along to your morals. Basically, it's really difficult, absolutely. But you cannot do that with only the rule set. I think we've seen that in many other sports. You know, there are rule sets that are this. No one can read them all,
right.
and it's really hard. They're really hard to follow. And you see other things. Maybe I'm romanticizing it, but in Japanese martial arts, in Budo, there is a code around how you can behave. And I think historically it's been like that too. I mean, you hear all the time accounts about tournaments, etc., and then someone is called out for acting in an unchivalrous manner, and even if they didn't have it specified in a rule set, everyone understood what that meant. and peer pressure made that person behave.
Right, but on the other hand, those guys who managed to, let's say, work around the codified rules were also praised. Like, think Miyamoto Musashi, for example, who did everything wrong, but yet won everything he engaged in.
Yeah.
And now he's a figure in Japanese culture, despite violating it.
Absolutely.
Basically, right? So, I mean, do you see place for it in shaping fencing culture? These, let's say, rebels.
Yeah, of course. I mean, every notion has to be challenged, or we will stagnate. I mean, we have to accept there will always be conflict. We're fencers after all, you know. So we will always argue about things.
Right.
And then we have to accept that, and then say, okay, what is the argument about today, and what can we do about that? And then next year we will argue about something else and see where we are. And we do have to accept that that's going to be a part of it. There's absolutely room for these rebels. If they weren't, we would not be challenged in our ideas.
So have you seen any rebels this year, Swordfish?
Well, there are so many different fencing cultures here. You know, and for example, this is the first time we've had several Russian longsword fencers, and they come from a background that is different from ours. And that's how it was when the Swedish and Poles start to compete with each other the first times too. Not only do we fence in different ways, which means that a Swedish judge is maybe used to a Swedish person's way of motion, but not the Polish person, so he will be more difficult for him, and vice versa, and so on. But we also have different ideas about what is good fencing, what is honorable fencing, what is a proper way to behave in a competition. Those things can be fundamentally different. And we've had the same experience with Italians or with Dutch people, you know, and then slowly you have this merger, but there's no guarantee that we're all going to come up and think the same in the end. Absolutely not.
Probably not.
Probably not.
And maybe that's for the better.
I would say so. I'm happy that people have that we argue with each other, that we fight with each other. It would be strange if we didn't.
Right.
But we should be happy that there are different ways of doing things. I mean, we look at how you do things in Poland. There are many things there that I really like, and if I want that experience, then I will go there. And if I go to Italy, I will get something else. We should not have McDonald's HEMA, right, when everything is the same.
You had some experience a few years ago, mostly with the Polish community, with Polish fencers, and what are your memories from that time?
Well, I have a lot of them actually, and I still meet them. Actually, I took this. I got it from Andrew at Spes, I think, a while back. So I thought it would be nice to put on a Polish T-shirt.
Good. Nice to see the.
Yeah, I met them. I've met you guys the first time in 2010.
Right.
And I have a lot of great memories from that, because the first time I came, it was the first time we've ever done a full contact steel competition. We did not have the equipment for that. But in Poland, you had the gloves that Jan Hodkiewicz designed that Barbara Śliwowska now sells.
Yeah, they are now sparring gloves.
Sparring gloves, yes. And you had faders that Jan had made, and you had the Gambison outfit that had great arm mobility, and you had a system for that. And for me, that was fantastic, because it felt like I was... Yeah, it leveled me up, and I got completely beaten up, and that was really nice too, because I learned so much that time, and it made me want to come back more and more and more. And we imported that way of fighting. We started using steel faders. I mean, the whole world now uses these gloves, and the Axel Pettersson fencing jacket is based on the of medieval market and Spes early gambesons that you use in Poland still.
Right.
So. It's hard to exaggerate the importance the Polish community has had for HEMA in general, because you had full contact steel fighting, and now everyone does that. But you were the first, and everyone sort of has the same level of equipment comes from Poland. The other main thing that made an impact on me was there's a lot of passion in Poland, and I think in the West people some are. There are a lot of hard, tough people here, but some of them are also, we are a bit soft maybe, and we don't have this kind of warrior mentality. It's more frequent in Poland.
Okay.
It's you see it with every nation across the world that I've been to. There are always warriors, but in Poland I found more of them faster than in many other places, and I like that too. Right? Then we have a lot of conflicts, of course, because we're fighters and we disagreed on rule sets, and there were
strong personalities.
And it was. I mean, for example, I was very close friend with Jan Hodkiewicz, and we don't speak as much now. That's a shame, but I mean, I'm not angry and I'm not upset. It was that Poles and Swedes had a conflict. That's very historical.
Yeah, but it's. I mean, from what I know, nothing of it lingers in Poland anymore. So
no, not here either. We have had so many conflicts with other countries now.
okay, so you're busy.
Yeah, we're busy, and I'm sure you are too. No, it's nothing like that. And I think it was a good learning experience for everyone. I think at that time, the international community was we were still very competitive, but we were just learning how to relate to each other. And Swordfish now, we have even more cultures and countries coming in, and the atmosphere is more relaxed. People got that out of their system, I think, and there are always Polish people coming here, you know. So no, that's not a problem anymore. But I had a lot of great experiences with the Polish community. Absolutely, and I have since, you know. I meet you guys at different events, and I talk to Andrew at SPES, etc. So
okay. So thank you for that. And now I would like to get back to the fencing culture and the way to influence it. You already discussed the shame as a factor, and also recognition as, because it's the flip side of the same coin, right? But I think, and I expect you to agree, but you might surprise me, but I think that also the way HEMA is taught and introduced to people is a factor here. So what are your thoughts on the teaching methodology as a fencing culture building factor?
That is a very interesting question. When we started with HEMA, one of the main problems was that people used manuscripts as manuals. And I'm talking specifically about the early German tradition and Fiore, because some of the later manuals are written as instruction manuals. Okay, that's fine, rapiers. But the early German sources definitely are not. They show advanced fencing to people who are supposed to already know how to fight. And the fencing looked pretty bad because of that. And what people needed was gross motor skills, basic cuts and parries, and distance management, and a sense of timing. And that was not often described in the sources. So you have to go outside, and that's been a big thing for me. Well, how do you get good like that? And then you have to look outside of HEMA many times. You can either look at later sources. For example, it's very common to use the Saber number system, where your number cuts 1 to 8. I use that as a shorthand all the time for my students. Okay. And I think it's fantastic. But you can also look outside. I read sport fencing theory. I'm going to butcher his name, but Maestro Tchaikovsky, Zbigniew Tchaikovsky. Okay, thank you. He's fantastic. I love his book, and he's obviously read all the historical sources that he had available to him as well. And his way of explaining things like distance management and preparing the attack that I think you taught a class on. That's great, and that's a fantastic merger there, because the historical sources might say, prepare your attack really well. Okay, thank you, but how?
Right. Like win the fight.
Yeah, they do not tell us how, and then you can go and read Tchaikovsky, and he will give you a setup for how to learn that. Or again, you want the sources say you can learn these master cuts if you already know how to fence. Okay, what does that mean to already know how to fence? Okay, but if you look at Saber, military Saber with the 8 cuts and simple parries, that's a pretty good start. So what happens then is that we have a modern or a mixed training method applied to the historical sources, and for some people they can feel that it's difficult to make that merger. And what I do mostly is to make sure that for me that merger functions. So my teaching method is a mix of by the book historical training and my own modern pedagogic approach, which is definitely still developing, and it's pretty organic right now, but I can freely say I take a lot of inspiration from modern sport fencing, from boxing and other disciplines. And to come back to culture, then I'm slowly coming back to you need to pay service to the historical sources. Otherwise, the disconnect will be so big that this would just be a modern sport art, sword art, and not historical European martial art. And where exactly you put yourself there, okay, that can vary. Some people just train by one manuscript and one manuscript, only they do nothing else. That's very nice, but that often becomes just a reenactment project. Often they don't have the necessary fighting skills that are not because they're not described in that manual, because the manual is a manuscript rather than a teaching. And others, they go out and they just do modern fencing with a longsword, but because it's a longsword, they say they're historical European martial arts. And between those two, there's a lot of space. And I think most of us end up in there there in between. My personal motive is to be a very good historical fencer. So I don't want to do sport fencing with longsword, but again, I realize that you need to train concepts that are not described in Ringek or Lichtenau.
Sure.
And what I think we should try to strive for is to merge a pedagogical teaching approach, but use as much concepts or explain it with as much of the old terminology as possible, because that makes us keep remembering that we are doing historical European martial arts. And when you do that, you are not a consumer. You don't go and just play with that. You are a part of recreating this cultural heritage of ours, and that's a very important job. And you want to infuse your students and your members with that feeling. I think that's a very good start, and that's where how to teach is combined with how to maintain a proper culture. I mean, I think my students should know the 17 Hauptstücke of Lichtenau. They should know who he was. They should understand part of the history and the culture where these arts come from and origin.
Okay, fine. So my final question: can you name any factors that separate, let's say, sporty or modern fencing from the historical equivalent?
Offline footwork would be one. The intent behind the attacks.
What do you understand as such?
The force behind the landing touch, and what that does to how you apply your body, for example. And if there is an intent to hit and then not be hit in the following tempo, the after blow, basically. And I would call that that would separate it also. The ability to use clearly recognized historical techniques like the Zwerhau, or something else. But there's also a huge overlap. I mean, what is the Absetzen? It's a counter thrust in opposition. Is that how you would say it?
Yeah.
I have only done 2 sport fencing classes, but I've read some of the books. I wish I could do more. It's great. So I mean, the overlap is huge, and I think that the modern way of talking is usually very clear, whereas the old way of the old books can be very archaic.
That's right. Okay, so
another thing would be using historically or easily visible guards, for example. That would also it's a mechanical and a tactical choice that you make, and that doesn't always line up together with perfect success in competition. Which again is why maybe we should start looking at different ways of how to judge. I mean, if you look at MMA and others and Budo, they don't just judge the landed hits, they judge your ring dominance, your technique variety and all these things, and that's something that is rather unexplored in HEMA, but it's something we should explore for sure.
Okay, and so if we touched upon the subject of judging not only the hits landed, what do you think about the idea of ippon?
The perfect.
Yes, the finishing blow.
The finishing blow. Well, it's hard if everything is open for interpretation.
Right.
Right. Because I've thought about Ippon, and my cousin actually, she was in the Swedish Olympic team for judo, so we have talked a lot about that. But I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea. I'm open to every kind of idea that makes the fencing look nice, the way we want it to, which again also is different depending on which person you ask.
Sure.
I can try to define as well as I can, but I can't define it completely. Ippon is good, but again, what is a perfect Zwerhau? There will also be a very different answer depending on who you ask. But I think there's enough common ground. Some of the rules that I've seen almost have this. If you go to long point, there have been some times when I've been there where the bout goes to 9 points, and if you land a perfect Meisterhau or Borgenhau that establishes a dominant bind and hits the person in one tempo, if you want to use tempo, that's 7 points. So then you almost win the bout with that. That is almost Ippon. That could work, yes. If it's the best thing, I don't know, because then a lot of things is hung up on that one attack and that one exchange. And I think, as a general rule, it doesn't have to be necessarily so, but as a general rule, the less every exchange is worth, the less a mistake by the judges is worth.
Right.
So if you can get 9 points in a 9-point bout, then if one judge's mistake is very, very important. But if it's only 2 points or if it's only 1 point per exchange in a 10-point bout, it will even out. I mean, they're always the thing with judges and so on, but the less they make a difference, the less their mistakes have an impact.
Okay. So thank you very much for the interesting conversation.
Thank you. I would like to make this point too, that these are my opinions, and tomorrow I might think differently. And
Sure.
Sweden and Nordic countries have very many different ideas on how to do things. Absolutely. I made this comment yesterday during the live stream that we want to try out a lot of different new things. 2 months ago, we worked what I believe to be the way you do it in Poland, and because it's been a while since I was there, so I'm not entirely sure.
What do you mean?
It was 1 point for the whole, regardless, and you could not score on the afterblow. And we had 1 head referee and 1 assistant referee, or 2 assistant referees, and it was a rectangular arena.
Okay.
And
how did it work out?
Well, really good and really bad. I mean, it's easy to score, and finishers tended to go for more shallow targets. And it was a one-off. I think we should do it for 2 years, and then you should ask me again. But I've seen it in so many places. I sort of know what it would work out. One fantastic advantage is that we could run a lot of fights. The Swordfish arenas are really big, and we have so much staff. But if I did it in the Polish way, I could have 200 or 300 people come to Swordfish in the same longsword tournament. So, like, just from an administrative perspective, it makes a lot of sense. But it's also it makes it easier to judge. Like, the number of percent correct called hits, of course, go up because there are less factors to take into consideration.
Okay, I see.
So we will do a lot of things like that. We had an experiment yesterday also with continuous fencing, like boxing, and that's a completely different approach. And yeah, you're gonna have to look for very different things compared to how you do things or how we do things, or how the long point guys in American East Coast, how they do things. It's a different approach, but it's also historically correct. We've seen the accounts of how the effectually competitions happen when they go in and they do all the and it's the highest hit that counts. So they got hit several times on the way in, and that was considered okay for them. So I mean, you want to at least explore that idea before you decide if it's good or bad.
Sure. Okay. So one final question, since you touch a bit the subject, for people in Poland. Basically, the long point system and the Nordic League system looks the same. They see no difference.
Oh, okay.
So could you explain a bit?
Yeah, the long point has changed a bit. As I wasn't there this year, so I'm not sure exactly how Jake and the others did it. But the longsword system is explicitly Kunstfechtes, Lichtenauer system. So and you can score more points in every exchange than we do. We usually have 2 points or 1 point, like for deep and shallow targets, and now we've tried 4 points and 2 points or 3 points, but it's sort of the same thing. But in long point, you can score more, and they're looking specifically for hits that land with a controlled bind. That scores you more. For us, it's just about deep and shallow.
Sure.
And they don't always weigh the afterblow as much as we do. So where for us you can score in the afterblow tempo, you can score higher. A lot of times that has not been the case in long point. It goes a bit back and forth, but as I remember it, that has not been an option in the last year or 2 years. We argue about that all the time.
Okay.
But I think those will be the 2 main differences.
Okay, so thank you.
Thank you.
So thanks again for the conversation.
Thank you, Maciej.